Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about the Gibbering Mouther. Okay, so let's start off, as we often do, with the first edition AD&D Monster Manual 2. In the Monster Manual 2, the Gibbering Mouther is described as an amoeboid form of life with many eyes and mouths that apparently lies in wait with those eyes and mouths closed, looking like a piece of earth, with its only motivation being to catch and eat its prey. It inhabits cold and underground regions, and it sort of moves by like oozing and sliming its way along. It's got an AC of 1. Now remember, this is descending armor class, so that's pretty damn good, because it can only be really injured by hitting the brain, which is in the centre of this gelatinous mass. The Gibbering Mouther has spit that bursts into a flare if it strikes a hard surface, and the flash from it can blind people. It can latch on with its many mouths and drain blood/hit points from its target. If 3 or more mouthers are attached to a person, they must make a roll to see if they are dragged down and engulfed by the mouthers. They can incoherently gibber, causing confusion in anyone within a 6-inch radius, unless they save versus spell. A mouther warms the ground under it and can change its consistency, turning it into a quicksand, sort of boggy-like texture. The artwork, as is typical of this book, is black and white, and it shows a jelly-like blob studded with eyes and mouths. Now, we're not going to go through all the various monster manuals with this one, because they're all pretty much the same, so we're going to skip straight from 1st edition to 5th edition. So, Love, why don't you tell us about the Gibbering Mouther in 5th edition?
Well, it's a very similar creature.
Yeah.
One of the most similar across the editions. It's a bit slicker in the way it's presented this time. We've got 3 specific abilities called amoeboid form, which is about it being able to like ooze around and stick its mouths out on tentacles.
Yep.
It's got mouths of madness, which is the confusion sort of power that it had before, and the confusion power was similar in that you're rolling a dice to see what effect it's going to have on you. Wisdom saving throw this time.
And what sort of effects might happen when you roll?
So you roll a d8, 1 to 4, you just stand paralysed.
Okay.
5 or 6, take no action, uses all its move to move in a random direction.
Yeah.
On a 7 or 8, you can make a melee attack against a randomly determined creature within your reach, or do nothing if you can't make such an attack.
Okay.
So you randomly turn around and attack your mates or anything else around.
Yeah.
Which I suppose could include the monster, but it's not that bothered because it's got such an amazing armour class.
Okay, so
9 in this version.
Which is obviously ascending armour class. That's not that amazing. An unarmoured human's got an AC of 10.
Oh, alright.
I presume she's got a scad load of hit points.
Yeah. 67 on average.
Yeah, so obviously what they've done in this edition is you're more likely to hit it, but it can soak a lot more damage, so it's getting the same result, just with a slightly different game mechanic, really. So what does it have any other interesting powers aside from causing people to go mad with its...
So we've also got all-consuming as one of the titles in the description.
Okay.
As in, it's going to try and eat anything it can.
Nice.
I notice this time it is just eating organic material, I think. Oh no, it also liquefies stone and eats that.
I see. I don't know whether it eats it. I think it just sort of like dissolves it. Was the impression I got from the 1st edition. Like it's almost as though like it's such like a mad thing that it like warps reality and like stone becomes all like malleable.
So it stood out to me that in the 1st edition it said it's a animal, vegetable or mineral.
Like the baby eating Bishop of Barton Wells.
But I think I think, as you say, it's not going to be eating base stone and just dirt. It's going to be stripping that of plant life.
Yeah.
It's possibly going to be eating, like, the more complex minerals. So maybe you get called to a dwarf mine because the seams run dry and they know that there was gold here before and now it's gone.
Yeah. Or maybe they're having a problem, like some of their tunnels have suddenly become impassable and they're like quicksand-like floors and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, just having an infestation of this in a mine would make for a really good, like, adventure. You could have a couple of miners trapped that you've got to go and save. You could have some other reason for the party to go in there. But it'd make for quite a good monster and quite a few traps that are very much in character with what's going on. Like you say, falling rocks, quicksand.
See, it strikes me now that one of the things it'd be useful for, one of the things I like to do in my games is, if the players go to like a dungeon and they like go away and they do other stuff and then they come back to that same dungeon later on, I've got like a little table where I like roll on it to find out like what's changed in the dungeon. So it could be like, a monster's left, part of it's flooded, another monster's arrived and taken over, or stuff like that. And one of the entries I've got on that is that some sort of creature has made like extra tunnels or extra rooms and expanded the dungeon. And it strikes me, among all the obvious ones like purple worms and stuff like that, that the Gibbering Mouther would be a good one for that. And you could have some quite bizarre sort of formed additional sort of caverns and tunnels because it had like liquefied the stone while it was like oozing through it. So I think that's pretty cool. One of the things I have noticed, and this is a bit weird, and we'll get onto this in a minute when we talk about Dragon Magazine 160, is the artwork sort of portrays it in this sort of like Shoggoth-like horrific sort of vibe.
It looks very Shoggoth.
Yeah. Oh, and again, we'll talk a bit about that.
It did in the first edition as well.
But one of the things that strikes me about it is obviously we know like Shoggoths are from the Cthulhu mythos, and they're sort of like supposed to be these horrific creatures. And the Gibbering Mouthers, they can drive people mad and stuff like that. One of the things that strikes me is that aside from the fact they can like drive you mad with the gibbering, they're not particularly like horrific. I mean, they look unpleasant, but you know, they're not exactly mind-bending horrors from beyond the outer darkness.
I don't know, love. I think maybe you've been desensitised a bit by the vast number of Jeffrey Combs movies we've watched over the years.
Yeah, that's probably true. Well, it seems as though it's not only me who was thinking that, because as we move on to talk about Dragon Magazine 160, which was obviously around in the sort of AD&D second edition era, they did an article called Ecology of the Gibbering Mouther. It was written by Nigel D. Findlay.
Oh yeah, the Ecology of articles, they were really good.
Yeah, and it had some really cool like sort of black and yellow artwork, and it had this nice catchy tagline on it which said, "All talk but no brains and a bottomless appetite to boot." And I like that as like a sort of catchy tagline. Unfortunately for me, and this is just personal preference, the article, like a lot of these ecology articles, consisted mostly of a massive piece of like in-character fiction with a few footnotes. And I'm not really a lover of the in-character fiction, as you know. I don't mind a little bit sprinkled at the start of a chapter, but like a whole article of it, you know, if I want to read a story, I can pick up a storybook. That's absolutely grand. But that is just personal preference, listeners, so don't be like giving me too much about that. However, the footnotes are actually really cool, and they give a lot of additional info. Like Gibbering Mouthers, they have this pungent smell that can be smelt up to 20 feet away, which can give them away. It confirms as well that Mouthers drain blood and nutrients from the victims, and it says that when the victims fall into a coma, they dissolve like the outer body tissue, but they sort of keep the central nervous system, brain, eyes and mouth alive, and sort of incorporate that into their own mass, so hence they get extra eyes and mouths. Now, since the victim has never technically died, they can't be resurrected, they can't be contacted via Speak with Dead or raised or anything like that. Now, inevitably, the ordeal drives the mind of the victim completely insane when they're incorporated into the Gibbering Mouther. But like I say, originally it didn't seem to be a very horrific creature for me, whereas this article, like, for me, really ramps up the horror vibe, because I cannot think of anything more horrific than, like, watching your own body dissolve, and then knowing that you've become part of the creature, but you're so, like, addled by what's happened, that you then become this creature that sort of goes on to, like, kill other people in the same horrible way you died. So it certainly seems like the author of the article was trying to, like, ramp up the horror vibe as well, and I expect they were sort of, like, thinking, oh yeah, it's a bit shock-off, like, you know, we'll ramp it up a bit. We also get told that the Gibbering Mouther doesn't need to breathe. We're told it can eat anything, so again, back to as we said earlier, and it reproduces by division like an amoeba.
Yeah.
It secretes a corrosive substance that apparently causes 1d4 hit point damage to anyone who touches them. And I think this is just a bit of an expansion of the stone sort of warping power. And like I said, after sort of first edition AD&D Monster Manual 2, it seems clear that the Gibbering Mouther was leaning more into that horror trope of like things like Lovecraft, you know, like films like The Thing, which is what this also reminds me of, you know, this sort of amorphous blob-like creature. Although when we get to 5th edition, that seems to have been very much played down. And I can understand why they do that. I expect it was a commercial decision, because obviously they're trying to sell the game to as many people as possible, so they can't put too much stuff in that's going to be controversial or overtly horrific. So I can see why they did that, but I do think it's a shame, because the more it was built on, the more of an interesting sort of creature it became.
See, it's not that you couldn't use any of that, it's just that they haven't provided a game mechanic for it.
Oh yeah, and I mean, don't get me wrong, for people like me who've been reading Dragon for like ages and know the old editions and whatever, I'd just be, even if I was in the likely event I was running 5th edition, I'd be like, yeah, I'll just use some of my earlier knowledge. But I think it's a shame that I expect there's a lot of people who maybe have started playing D&D now who wouldn't think to go and look at old Dragon magazines or wouldn't be able to get hold of them. So they wouldn't have that sort of knowledge. And now, they may bring out 5th edition books later on. You know, like in 3rd edition, they did the Book of Aberrations, which expanded on stuff like that. And I expect they'll get round to that sort of thing in 5th edition eventually. But until then, the actual default sort of just base standard 5th edition version just doesn't really seem that interesting. It's a big blob of jelly with some eyes and a mouth thing, you know. It's unpleasant, it's got a big stack of hit points, but...
See, the confusion power, the massive loads of noise, I get why that's horrible, but I have to switch the TV off if you want to talk to me, because I can't listen to both at the same time.
I'm all about that multitasking.
You'll have like 6 different things on and 2 of them running at double speed, and you'll be able to follow all of it.
Okay, so we mentioned earlier there was a link with Lovecraft and the sort of Shoggoth, a link in our minds. And I'd like to start off, if I can, with a quote from At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft that describes them. This is how the quote goes. "It was a terrible, indescribable thing, vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congery of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous and with myriads of temporary eyes, forming and unforming." And Lovecraft describes them as massive amoeba-like creatures made out of this iridescent black slime, multiple eyes floating on the surface. They don't have a default body shape. They can form limbs and organs. They tend to measure about 15 feet across. The story At the Mountains of Madness mentions the existence of much bigger ones, and they can take on any shape needed. The sort of Cthulhu mythos commonly portrays them as somewhat intelligent and having been created by the extraterrestrial elder things as like sort of mutable workforce, because they could adapt their body to any situation or tool that was required. But eventually they became more and more intelligent. They rebelled, and the elder things were sort of like overthrown by them. So I can see that you've got my old copy of the D20 Call of Cthulhu version there. So have you got anything to say about that?
So obviously it's got slightly different special abilities, but they're not that different from the Gibbering Mouther's abilities.
Yeah.
Again, they prefer cold, caves, tunnels, the abandoned city of the elder things in Antarctica.
Yeah.
Again, they can cause you to go mad. The big difference, I would say, is that the Shoggoth is a hell of a lot bigger. Average 465 hit points.
Damn!
Strength 45. It's a lot slower.
Yeah.
dex of 3, but it is considerably more intelligent than the Gibbering Mouther, with an intelligence of 7.
Well, the thing is, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, having more hit points but being slower. Because let's face it, in a Call of Cthulhu game, even like a D20 one, you're less likely to be like busting out those mad combat abilities and like going toe to toe with it. You're more likely to be like, oh right, I'm running the F away from that.
Yeah, it's very much suits the game style for each one of them. The way, if you were to consider it the same monster, the way it's been tweaked in each one.
Yeah.
If you wanted to combine them, the simple way to do it would be to say, oh, if you cut a small bit off a Shoggoth before it gets big enough to be a Shoggoth, it's a Gibbering Mouther.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know this, and I mean, if anyone out there knows, feel free to like drop us a voicemail and tell us. It certainly seems to me as though when they created the Gibbering Mouther, they probably read some Lovecraft, and they were like, right, we want something that's a bit like this. However, we can't make it the sort of all-consuming destroyer that it is in At the Mountains of Madness, because it's a D&D game where people are supposed to be able to take on monsters, kill them, get the treasure, get the XP, etc. So they've sort of tweaked it a bit, they've adapted it a bit, they've made it a bit harder to kill, but, you know, you can actually take on things like that in a D&D game.
So, on the thought of, like, combining old-style D&D dungeon crawl sort of stuff and Cthulhu sort of stuff, I can see there you've got the Realms of Crawling Chaos.
Yeah, I mean, this is a Labyrinth Lord, which is one of the sort of old-school D&D clones, book by Goblinoid Games, and it's all about incorporating Lovecraftian elements into like a dark fantasy game. So adapting it for D&D a little bit. And we've got an entry for the Shoggoth in here. It describes them as 15-foot blobs of viscous iridescent jelly, originally created by the Elder Things. Initially, they had very little intelligence of their own. They were genetically engineered, artificial life forms designed to be labourers for the Elder Things society and could be commanded mentally. They can form pseudopods of various tasks and other temporary organs or limbs. They're equally at home above or below water. After many thousands of years, they evolved a stable brain of their own and rebelled against their masters. Now they live in dark, hidden places, grotesquely aping a degenerate form of their previous master's culture. They're in a constant state of change, with eyes, mouths and other organs forming and dissolving. They can attack each round with 2 powerful pseudopods for 2d4 hit point damage each. They have a swallow attack, and any being swallowed must save versus death or be killed instantly. Otherwise, victims are, like if you make the save, victims are digested in 2d4 rounds. They can emit poisonous spittle with a range of 20 feet, which you have to make a save or be blinded permanently, which the Gibbering Mouther has. Sharp weapons do only half damage to Shoggoths, and they're immune to all cold-based attacks, however fire or heat deals double damage. They're described as chaotic evil. They've got an armour class of 4, which again, descending armour class is pretty good. And we can again see here that this version, which is specifically designed to be used with old school D&D, is very, very similar to the Gibbering Mouther. And obviously this is a version of the Shoggoth that's been adapted, because the point of stuff in Realm of Crawling Chaos is to like adapt Lovecraftian stuff for dark fantasy games or like D&D games where you're more likely to confront monsters than run away like you might do in Call of Cthulhu or something like that. So I think we're probably along the right tracks with like Gibbering Mouthers being like a sort of a Shoggoth that's been taken and sort of twisted and ironically like moulded a bit to fit the mores of the D&D game.
And quickly glancing over its stats in this, it's pretty much halfway in between the Call of Cthulhu D20 and...
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so we've chatted a bit about them in various different books. So let's just talk for a little bit about how you might use Gibbering Mouthers in games. Now, I think this is a paradoxical monster for me, because I find them both fairly uninteresting, as I said, as they're initially sort of portrayed. But when you add in some of this additional information, or when you sort of reference Lovecraft, they suddenly become much more interesting and great horror monsters.
I think it's one of those monsters that makes for a really good backdrop to a drama sort of a story. So you need... This could be a really good monster to use if you've got conflict with your player party and you want them to like have a bit of time to talk it out. Or if one of them's had like some plot element kicking off and you want to let them have a bit of melodrama of like things going on in their characters' lives with a Gibbering Mouther somewhere in the story so that there's a monster to fight.
Yeah.
But it's not really important to the story itself.
Yeah. See, I've sort of gone the opposite way in my thinking about it. I was thinking it'd be, like, amazing for a horror scenario, but obviously, like with most horror scenarios, there's a few things you've got to sort of think about to, like, get the best out of them, like, you know, show the effects that the monsters had on the surroundings and other people, rather than, like, just showing the monster itself. You know, like, keeping the monster off screen for as long as possible so you can build up the suspense. And then, you know, when your final confrontation happens, describe the monster in vague terms using words that convey a sense of unpleasantness and horror, like ichor, dripping, ichthoate, which is just begun or not fully formed. And, you know, because if you just sort of say it's a gibbering mouther, or you say, oh, it's this blob with, like, eyes and mouths on it, it doesn't convey the sort of horror you would feel if you were seeing something like that. So I think you have to get a little bit creative with your language and your description. Certainly avoid using the creature's name, but if you can show the sort of horrible effects it has and how it's warped the environment, it's driven people mad, then you can really build up that suspense. So by the time the players face it, they will be worried about it and scared about it.
Now, this is something where it might actually be beneficial to be doing a Zoom game for a creature like this, because there is nothing you can describe in 10 minutes that you can't sum up by putting 3 seconds of a John Carpenter movie on the screen and saying, your players see this, and letting people get on with it from there.
I mean, another thing you could do as well is if you had, like, a load of samples of, like, recorded voices or conversations, you could, like, play sort of, like, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 of them together at once, so you get like a mad sort of indistinct babble of voices. You could have that queued up when you're running your virtual tabletop or whatever as a sound file, have it like played a couple of times but they don't actually see the monster, so they'll be like, oh, what the hell's that, you know, have it quietly in the background, they hear it from just around the corner or whatever. Then when it does show it, you play it like really loudly, and then you go into like the horrible description of it, and that any sort of extra sort of sensory sort of information you can get, whether it's sound files, like a picture or whatever, has got to be a good thing, especially with like a horror creature where you're trying just not to show them a picture of it, because let's face it, we've looked at pictures from multiple editions here and none of the pictures are scary.
Yeah.
Whereas this sort of horrible description and this incoherent babbling is much more unsettling. Like, you're never going to fully sort of like terrify your players when you're all sat around comfortably playing D&D, but if you can make people feel unsettled and worried, obviously within limits, you don't want to make anyone uncomfortable enough that they're not enjoying the game, then you're at least halfway there towards that goal, and it'll really help add to the horror scenario.
And obviously we are also getting into the territory of make sure your players are going to enjoy that sort of a game.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
As we always do with horror games of any sort.
Yeah, although to be honest, personally, I do think if you run a horror game and then someone complains about it having horrifying elements in it, that's a bit TS for them.
But we are talking about using this in D&D as well, and it's great to have an occasional horror session in any story.
Yeah.
But you need to make sure you're picking the right monsters for the right players.
Yeah, I think if you were just going to suddenly like switch gear to like a horror scenario in a D&D game, as you say, you probably need to check that with your players, because they might have signed up for some like fun fantasy dungeon crawling, and maybe like the horror vibe's not what they're after. Which obviously you can use a Gibbering Mouther in a standard like dungeon crawl or fantasy style game, but I don't really think it plays to the creature's strength. But as you say, if you're going to switch gear and do like a horror session or two, you need to check that everyone's okay with that if they didn't originally sign up for a horror game. So I think that's it for our episode on the Gibbering Mouther. Apologies, we've got it out a little bit late, but the poll is up for our next monster on Twitter, so check that out and get your votes in. It'll be up for the next 2 days as we post this. If you'd like to get in touch with us, maybe chat about the Gibbering Mouther, make some suggestions of things you'd like to see in the future, or just talk about anything else related to RPGs, there's a couple of ways you can get in touch with us. One of which is to leave a voicemail using the SpeakPipe website. There's a link down below. And the other is you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and whatever you're playing, have fun.
Bye.